I stood at the iron gates of my parents' estate in Connecticut, the chill of an early autumn evening biting through my coat, my fingers trembling, not just from the cold, but from the weight of 32 years of silence. Inside, light spilled from crystal chandeliers, music pulsed with the rhythm of a live jazz band, and laughter rolled out onto the manicured lawn as one luxury car after another arrived with elegantly dressed guests stepping out as though this were a gala at the Ritz. It was not the governor's fundraiser, nor a society wedding. It was my brother Ethan's birthday banquet, another lavish celebration for the golden child. I glanced down at the small white box in my hand, a cake I had picked up at the corner bakery, chocolate with vanilla frosting just 6 inches wide. Something modest yet meaningful, the kind of cake no one in my family had ever bought for me. The candles rattled inside as my grip tightened. Tonight was my 27th birthday, and once again, no one inside that mansion cared. I could hear my mother's voice carrying over the crowd, sharp and commanding as she directed the waitstaff to pour champagne for Ethan's toast. I could picture her diamonds glinting at her neck, smiling as though this night was her triumph. My father would be at the center table puffing his chest, boasting about Ethan's latest promotion, and Ethan himself, 32, tall, smug, basking in the glow of 200 guests who treated him like a prince. For years, this pattern had repeated. Year after year, their son got a banquet, a full orchestra, designer cakes taller than I was, photographers capturing every moment. Year after year, I stood on the edge's invisible forgotten left to whisper happy birthday to myself in the bathroom mirror. And now, at 27, nothing had changed. I wanted to believe that maybe this year would be different, that maybe the text from my mother earlier, "Don't forget to dress appropriately." Lots of important guests tonight meant there would be a seat at the table waiting for me. But I knew better. The truth settled heavy in my chest. I wasn't invited as a daughter, not even as a sister, only as decoration if I dared to enter. Or worse, as unpaid help. The small cake box in my hand felt like a cruel joke. My birthday gift to myself was evidence of just how far I had been erased from this family. As I lingered at the gates, a valet approached, assuming I was a late-arriving guest. His eyes flicked to the cake in my hands, confusion flashing across his face before he offered to park a car I did not have. I shook my head, stepping back, suddenly aware that I did not belong here. Inside, the applause roared as someone announced Ethan's grand entrance. I could imagine him descending the staircase in his tailored suit, grinning as the spotlight caught his polished shoes, every eye on him. Meanwhile, I stood outside in the shadows, my birthday unacknowledged my existence a stain they chose to scrub away. The sting of betrayal was not new, but tonight it cut deeper. Maybe it was the contrast to the sight of crystal chandeliers against my reflection in the dark window. Maybe it was the memory of years spent paying their bills while my brother traveled Europe on my parents' dime. Maybe it was the sound of 200 voices singing for him while my own name went unspoken. Something in me cracked a fissure that had been forming for decades. I realized I could not simply walk away again, swallow the pain, pretend it didn't matter. Not this year. Not anymore. I pressed the cake box to my chest, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Happy birthday, Marissa." My voice shook, but for the first time in years, it was steady enough to hear. In that moment, amid the cold, the music, the laughter I was excluded from, I felt the spark of something fierce, something unyielding. If they wanted to erase me, I would carve my presence into their perfect banquet with undeniable proof. This time I promised myself it would not end with me forgotten at the gate. When I was 8 years old, I remember waking up to the smell of frosting and balloons squeaking against the ceiling. For a moment, my little heart leapt because I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents had remembered my birthday. I tiptoed into the kitchen only to find my mother carefully arranging a 3-tier cake, decorated with gold trim, and my father stringing lights across the porch. It wasn't for me. It was for Ethan, who had just turned 13, a milestone they said mattered. I stood there in my pajamas holding a paper crown I had cut out myself, and no one even looked up. That night, 200 people filled our house. A live band played swing music, and I sat in the hallway with a cupcake. Mrs. Bennett, our neighbor, had slipped into my hand when she saw my empty plate. The candle I lit in secret sputtered out before I could finish singing to myself. At 15, I thought I had finally found courage. I asked my parents if I could invite a few friends over for a birthday sleepover. My mother laughed as though I had told a joke. "You know the budget is going toward Ethan's 16th, she said, waving me off. On my actual birthday, Ethan's car, an imported BMW my father proudly bought, was parked in the driveway like a monument. My gift. A $5 bill left on the kitchen counter. No card, no hug. That evening, I scraped together my allowance, walked to the corner store, and bought a single frosted cupcake. I ate it on the porch, listening to fireworks from another family's celebration down the block. My parents never asked how I spent my night. At 21, college graduation came, but my moment was swallowed whole. Ethan had just secured a management position at my father's firm. The party my parents threw was not for me walking across that stage after working 3 jobs to pay tuition. It was for Ethan signing a contract. I showed up in my gown diploma clutched tightly, only to watch guests raise glasses in his honor. My father even said we couldn't be prouder of our son. I wanted to scream, "I'm your daughter too," but the words froze in my throat, smothered by polite applause and champagne toasts. Every year blurred together each birthday, a quiet ritual of self-preservation. Sometimes I bought myself a slice of pie, sometimes a candle from the dollar store. I told myself it didn't matter that birthdays were childish, that love couldn't be measured in cakes or balloons. But deep down, the wound festered. It wasn't about cake. It was about being seen, about mattering enough to have my name spoken out loud in joy rather than forgotten in silence. Over the years, the pattern became so predictable I stopped hoping. My parents had mastered the art of erasure, making Ethan the center of gravity while I orbited invisibly. Every milestone in his life was a headline. Every achievement of mine was a footnote. The imbalance wasn't an accident, it was design of family architecture that built Ethan's throne on the foundation of my silence. By 27, I carried the scars of each forgotten candle, each empty chair, each night. I whispered my own birthday wish to no one. I thought I had grown numb, but standing outside that banquet hall, hearing my brother's name echo like a royal decree, I knew the numbness had only been armor. Beneath it, the pain still burned, and this year it threatened to consume me. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, and erased had built a storm inside me, one that was no longer content to stay silent. When I turned 19, I had a full scholarship waiting for me at Boston University. It was everything I had worked for: late nights, tutoring other students' summers, spent shelving books at the public library, every ounce of energy poured into grades. But the acceptance letter arrived the same week my father collapsed at work with a heart attack. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with the letter trembling in my hands while my mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Your place is here. Family first." And just like that, my dream of leaving, of finally carving a life for myself, dissolved into obligation. Ethan didn't even come home from his backpacking trip across Europe. He sent a postcard from Paris, 3 words, "Wish you well." That was his contribution while I took on 2 jobs to keep the household afloat. By 21, I was working as a bank teller by day and pouring drinks at a bar downtown by night. Every paycheck went toward hospital bills, mortgage payments, and groceries. I learned to calculate interest rates in the morning and mix martinis in the evening. My hands were always sore, my eyes always heavy, but when I looked at my father's medicine bottles lined up on the counter, I told myself it was worth it. Still, no one thanked me. No one said, "We see you." My mother would murmur that Ethan was working on important things while I was just getting by. She called my sacrifices duty, as if duty excused their indifference. The bitterest part was that Ethan never faced those expectations. When he wanted to move to Los Angeles for a year to find himself, my parents wired him money for rent. When I asked for help covering 1 month's electricity bill after the bar cut my hours, my father snapped, "A real adult doesn't beg." The hypocrisy was staggering, but I swallowed it, telling myself survival was more important than fairness. At 24, when the company I worked for full-time finally offered me a junior financial analyst position, I thought maybe my parents would notice. They didn't. My mother asked if Ethan's girlfriend could borrow money for a business venture. I said no, and she called me selfish. Meanwhile, I kept paying down debts that weren't mine, always the safety net no one admitted existed. My sacrifices weren't just financial. They were emotional, too. I missed weddings, skipped vacations, said no to friendships because I couldn't afford the time or the money. I remember sitting alone on my 25th birthday, too exhausted to even buy a slice of cake, eating leftover Chinese takeout at the kitchen table, while scrolling through photos of Ethan popping champagne on a yacht. It wasn't just neglect, it was calculated disregard. The truth is, I wanted so badly for them to see me, to say that my sacrifices mattered. Each time I gave up something, I convinced myself this was the one that would earn recognition. That if I stayed, if I helped, if I worked harder, they would look at me and see a daughter worth loving. But the recognition never came. The only thing that grew was the void inside me, wide and echoing, filled with the sound of their laughter at Ethan's endless banquets, while my own milestones slipped by unnoticed. Looking back, I realize every sacrifice had a cost I didn't fully understand. It wasn't just the missed opportunities or the empty birthdays. It was the erosion of self, the quiet way I convinced myself I didn't deserve celebration, that invisibility was normal. And standing outside those gates at 27, I understood for the first time that my sacrifices had not made me loved, they had made me invisible. And invisibility was no longer something I could endure. When I turned 26 for the first time in my life, something extraordinary happened. After years of grinding away at the financial firm, staying late to finish reports, no one else wanted volunteering for projects that promised no recognition. I finally closed a major account. The contract boosted the company's revenue by 41% that quarter. My boss called me into his office, shook my hand, and handed me a bonus check worth $82,000. I stared at the numbers on the page, hardly believing they were real. For once, it felt like the universe was telling me that I mattered, that my work had weight, that I wasn't invisible. I went home that night and sat on my bed, the check glowing in the lamplight like some golden ticket. I imagined buying myself something nice, maybe a vacation to Hawaii, maybe a new car, maybe even putting a down payment on a place of my own. For the first time in years, my birthday was coming, and I allowed myself to dream. Maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. Maybe I would walk into my parents' house with proof that I was successful, that I deserved to be celebrated. Maybe I'd finally get more than silence. But my phone buzzed before the ink on the check was even dry. It was a group chat my mother had created with my father, Ethan, and me. The message read, "Congratulations, Marissa. We heard about your bonus. Such a proud moment for our family. Speaking of which, Ethan's birthday banquet is coming up. It would mean the world if you contributed. $20,000 should cover the extra string quartet and the imported champagne." My hands froze around the phone. I reread the words again and again, waiting for the punchline, the part where someone said, "And of course we're planning something special for you, too." But that part never came. I sat there staring at their words, feeling my chest tighten. They hadn't congratulated me because they cared. They hadn't even asked how I wanted to celebrate my own life. They had seen my success and immediately measured how it could be harvested for Ethan's glory. I wanted to scream into the phone, to throw it against the wall. Instead, I typed, "I'll think about it," and pressed send. In the weeks that followed, my hope flickered like a fragile flame. I told myself that maybe if I helped again, if I gave them what they wanted, they would finally see me. I signed the transfer for $20,000, watching the digits vanish from my account with a sick feeling in my stomach. I told myself it was an investment in belonging, that when I walked into Ethan's banquet, there would be a seat with my name on it, that someone would raise a glass to me even just for a second and say, "Marissa, we are proud of you." But as the date drew closer, the truth became harder to ignore. Ethan called me once, not to thank me, not to ask how I was, but to remind me to wear something appropriate since there would be important people there. My mother sent me a list of tasks she wanted me to handle at the banquet, coordinate with the florist. Double-check the seating chart, help manage the valet line. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't even a guest. I was staff paid not with gratitude, but with my own sacrifice. On the night of the banquet, I walked through the doors carrying that tiny bakery cake I had bought for myself. My name wasn't on the seating chart. No one mentioned my birthday. The only acknowledgement I received was when my father handed me a tray of champagne flutes and said, "Make yourself useful." And in that instant, my fragile hope shattered. I realized that I could give them all my money, all my time, all my years, and still I would never be celebrated. To them, I would always be invisible, a servant in my own family. That night, as I watched Ethan bask in applause beneath the chandeliers, my hands clenched around the tray until my knuckles turned white. The betrayal wasn't new, but the clarity was. Hope had been crushed beneath their indifference, and in its place, something sharper began to grow anger resolve, the first hint of defiance. 2 days after the banquet, I sat alone in the family library, a room filled with leather-bound volumes no one in the house actually read. My father had left me to straighten up after the event, a task more suited to the hired staff than a daughter, but I didn't argue. As I dusted shelves and stacked neglected folders, my eyes fell on a mahogany cabinet pushed into the corner. It was one of those locked storage units my mother used to stash old photographs and financial records. Out of habit more than intent, I tugged on the drawer, and to my surprise, it slid open with a faint squeak. Inside, stacks of photo albums sat neatly arranged, each spine labeled with gold lettering. My pulse quickened as I slid the first one out, Ethan, age 5. I opened it to find page after page of him smiling, his face smeared with frosting balloons floating behind him. Guests filled the background, their clothes fashionable, the tables covered in food. My fingers trembled as I flipped to the next album, Ethan, age 10. Another banquet, another towering cake, another 100 faces. I reached for Ethan, age 18, and stared at a glossy image of him cutting into a 5-tier masterpiece beneath a chandelier, his friends surrounding him. Every page screamed celebration, recognition, love. I searched for myself, desperately hoping I'd been included somewhere, anywhere. But the albums bore only one name, Ethan. Not a single label mentioned Marissa. I rifled through them until my hands shook, tears threatening to spill. When I finally reached the bottom, I found a slim folder of receipts. Curiosity overtook me and I pulled them free. The numbers hit harder than any insult ever had. $12,000 for Ethan's 10th, $19,000 for his 21st, $25,000 for his 30th. Each year, the amounts rose like a ledger of favoritism, investments into his image, his glory. And for me, nothing. Zero. A blank line where my name should have been. I sank into the leather chair, the receipts spread across my lap like damning evidence. For the first time, it wasn't just memory against their denial. It was proof. Cold, irrefutable proof. The truth I had always known but never been able to show stared back at me in black ink and glossy photographs. They hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen to erase me. I thought back to every excuse they had given. We were too busy. It slipped our minds. We'll make it up to you. Lies, all of them. The albums told the real story. They had money, time, and effort. They just never spent it on me. I was not overlooked by accident. I was overlooked by design. The weight of the receipts pressed into my hands heavier than any box I had ever carried. My throat tightened, my stomach churned, but beneath the sickness came something fierce, a rising certainty that I could no longer be silent. These albums were not just family memories. They were a ledger of betrayal, one I could show the world. That night, I tucked several receipts and a handful of photos into my bag. My hands still shook as I zipped it shut, but there was clarity now. I had proof that I had been erased, that my sacrifices were not forgotten, but deliberately dismissed. For the first time, I held evidence, not just emotion, and I knew I would use it. The invitation came 3 days later, though it wasn't really an invitation, it was more of a summons. My mother's voice rang through the phone, brisk and commanding. "We're hosting a small family dinner this Friday," she said. "Ethan will be introducing some new business partners. You'll be there, of course. Wear something understated, we don't want you drawing attention away." I bit down on my lip to stop myself from laughing. Me draw attention away from Ethan. It was absurd. Still, I agreed, my voice flat, because by then I already knew what I had to do. That night, I spread the evidence across my tiny apartment floor. The photos, the receipts, the spreadsheets I had secretly copied from the cabinet. Each piece was a shard of truth, a weapon honed by decades of neglect. I arranged them in order: Ethan's 5th birthday, Ethan's 16th, Ethan's 30th, thousands of dollars poured into each celebration. and beside them a blank sheet of paper representing my birthdays, unmarked, forgotten, erased. The contrast was undeniable. Even someone who had never met us would see the favoritism as clearly as I had lived it. For the first time in years, I felt power in my hands. Proof. Not just feelings, not just complaints they could dismiss as bitterness. Hard, irrefutable proof. But with that power came fear. What if they twisted it, called me ungrateful, made me the villain yet again? My mind raced with memories of every time they'd gaslighted me into silence. Still, I couldn't ignore the burning in my chest, the voice that whispered, "This time you cannot walk away." I slipped the receipts and photos onto a flash drive, carefully scanning each one at the office printer after hours. Then I tucked the originals into an envelope and hid them beneath the loose floorboard in my bedroom. If they tried to deny me, I would have 2 layers of truth to stand on. On Friday, I dressed carefully, a simple black dress, modest but sharp, something that made me look like the professional I was, rather than the servant they wanted me to be. I brushed my hair back, applied lipstick with steady hands, and looked into the mirror. "You're not invisible," I whispered to my reflection. The words sounded foreign, but they steadied me. As I drove toward my parents' estate, headlights cutting through the dusk, I rehearsed what I would say. How I would present the evidence. How I would make them face what they had done. My heart pounded, sweat dampening my palms against the steering wheel, but my resolve hardened with every mile. When I arrived, the house was already buzzing. Cars lined the driveway, guests in suits and cocktail dresses spilling across the lawn. From inside, I heard the familiar swell of laughter, the clink of glasses. A scene I had witnessed 1,000 times, always as a ghost at the edge. Not tonight. Tonight, I would not stand in the shadows. As I stepped into the foyer, my grandmother caught my arm. Her eyes, sharp even in her old age, searched mine. "You look ready," she whispered, pressing my hand. Then, leaning close so no one else could hear, she added, "If you have something to say, say it. Don't let them drown you out again." For a moment, I nearly broke the lump in my throat, swelling. But I nodded. I was ready. With the flash drive tucked into my purse and determination in my veins, I walked toward the dining room where Ethan and my parents held court. Tonight, I would no longer be silent. Tonight, I would set the table with truth. The dining room glittered as though it belonged to royalty. A chandelier dripped with crystal candles flickered across a table long enough to seat 30, and silver cutlery gleamed under the soft light. My mother sat at the far end, posture regal, her diamonds catching every flicker. My father occupied the head of the table, a glass of brandy in his hand, while Ethan lounged like a king on his throne, surrounded by business partners who laughed at every smug remark he made. My seat, I noticed immediately, wasn't even at the table. A side chair had been placed against the wall, as though I were staff waiting to be summoned. I clenched my jaw and took the seat anyway, my purse heavy with the flash drive inside. I waded through the appetizers, through my mother's performative compliments to Ethan, through my father's boast about Ethan's latest contract until I felt my pulse in my temples. Then, when my mother raised her glass for a toast, I stood. The scrape of my chair against the polished floor silenced a dozen conversations. Forks paused mid-air, eyes turned toward me. My voice trembled only for the first 2 words. "Excuse me." Then I steadied, projecting across the long table. "Before we raise another glass to Ethan, I want to raise one simple question. When was the last time anyone here remembered my birthday?" Murmurs rippled. My mother's smile froze her glass suspended mid-air. My father's brow furrowed. Ethan rolled his eyes, dramatically muttering, "Not this again." "Yes," I said louder now. "This again. Because for 32 years, you've remembered every detail of Ethan's life, his parties, his milestones, his successes. You've spent thousands of dollars on banquets like this one." I pulled the envelope from my purse and tossed the receipts onto the polished table. 12,000 for his 10th, 19 for his 21st, 25 for his 30th. You documented it all in photo albums year after year. But do you know what you spent on me? I lifted a single blank sheet of paper I had tucked into the envelope. The silence deepened. Nothing. Not a penny, not a single candle. Gasps came from a few of the guests, their eyes darting between the receipts and the photos I now laid out across the table. Ethan's smiling face, cake after cake, banquet after banquet. The evidence glared under the chandelier's light. My mother stammered, "Marissa, this is hardly the time." "No," I cut her off, my voice sharp ringing louder than the crystal. "This is the time. Because tonight is not just Ethan's 32nd birthday. Tonight is my 27th, my birthday. And once again, you erased me. You used me as free labor, as a wallet, as nothing more than background noise. But not anymore." My father's face turned red, his fist tightening around his brandy glass. "You're embarrassing yourself. Sit down." I met his eyes, my heart pounding but unyielding. "No, Father. I'm not embarrassing myself. I'm embarrassing you. And the truth should embarrass you." The room was still heavy with tension. A guest whispered to another, "Is this true?" Another leaned forward to study the receipts. Ethan pushed back his chair, his voice dripping with disdain. "So you want attention? Fine, here it is. You've always been jealous. That's what this is, isn't it?" "Jealous." I shot back, my voice sharp as glass. "Of what? Of being the golden son who drains this family of money and compassion while others bleed themselves dry to keep it afloat. If jealousy means wanting basic recognition, then maybe. But I don't think asking for a cake for a seat at the table for love makes me jealous. It makes me human." For a long moment, no one moved. My grandmother's eyes shone with quiet pride at the end of the table. My mother's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and my father, trembling with rage, slammed his brandy glass onto the table, the sound like a gunshot. But even that didn't drown out the truth, now spread before everyone. I straightened my voice, calm but firm. "You will not erase me again. Not tonight. Not ever." The silence cracked when my mother slammed her glass down and rose to her feet. Her diamond necklace glittered as she clutched her chest, her voice trembling but calculated. "Marissa, how dare you bring this up here of all places? You think family is about cakes and parties? Family is about sacrifice. Family is about doing what needs to be done, not whining because you didn't get a candle every year." She turned to the guests, her eyes wet with tears that looked rehearsed. "She doesn't understand. She never has. We gave her everything, and this is how she repays us, by humiliating us in front of company." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the table, not directed at me, but at the ugliness of the scene. My father seized the opening, his voice booming like a gavel. "Your mother is right. You are ungrateful. Who fed you? Who put a roof over your head? Who paid for your education until you were old enough to do it yourself? And now you come in here waving papers around like some kind of prosecutor, as if this family owes you something. You owe us Marissa. Every penny you've ever made, every success you've had, came because of this family." The word "owe" slammed into me like a physical blow. I had worked 2 jobs to pay down their debts, skipped college dreams to keep my father alive, funneled money into their mortgage. I didn't owe them. I had been paying their debts all along. But before I could speak, Ethan leaned forward, his smirk dripping with contempt. "God, you really are pathetic. Still hung up on birthdays. Still playing the victim. Grow up, Marissa. Not everything is about you. Some of us have real responsibilities." Heat burned behind my eyes, but I stood my ground. "Real responsibilities." I shot back, my voice rising. "While I was working double shifts to pay Dad's hospital bills, you were drinking champagne in Paris. While I was wiring money to cover the electric bill, you were buying yourself a yacht. Don't talk to me about responsibilities." Ethan rolled his eyes. "There it is. The martyr act. You love playing the long-suffering saint, don't you? Newsflash, nobody asked you to sacrifice. You chose it, and now you want applause. That's not noble, that's pathetic." My mother clasped her pearls tighter, her tears now flowing freely. "Do you see what she's doing? She's tearing this family apart. On Ethan's birthday, no less. You've always been dramatic, Marissa. Always twisting things to make us look bad." Gaslighting. The word pounded in my mind like a drumbeat. This was their strategy every time. Twist the truth, paint me as unstable, make me doubt what I knew to be real. But not this time. Not with evidence spread across the table, staring every guest in the face. I drew a breath, steadying my voice. "I'm not twisting anything. I'm showing you what you don't want anyone else to see. The albums, the receipts, they don't lie. You can cry, you can shout, you can call me ungrateful, but you cannot erase the truth anymore." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across a few guests' faces. They looked at the evidence, then at my parents, then back at me. The cracks were showing, but my family wasn't done yet. My father's voice dropped low like a warning growl. If you walk down this path, Marissa, don't think you can ever come back. You'll regret it. My chest tightened, but even as fear coiled in my stomach, a different feeling rose, stronger defiance. For once, I wasn't shrinking under their words. For once, I wasn't letting them define me. The gaslight flickered, but I saw it for what it was, a desperate attempt to keep me small. The room was thick with tension, the air so heavy it felt like breathing smoke. My father's threat still hung between us, his voice echoing in my head. You'll regret it. My mother's tears sparkled like weapons, her performance convincing enough to sway anyone who hadn't lived inside her web. Ethan smirked smug in his certainty that I would back down fold under the weight of their judgment the way I always had. But before I could summon my next words, a voice at the far end of the table cut through the silence like a blade. Enough. All eyes turned. My grandmother Eleanor Cole, 81 years old, frail in frame but unyielding in spirit, pushed back her chair and rose. Her silver hair gleamed under the chandelier, her cane steady against the polished floor. The room hushed because Eleanor had always commanded a kind of respect that no performance could counterfeit. Her gaze swept the table landing last on me. Marissa is not wrong, she said, her voice clear, resonant, every syllable striking like a hammer. My mother blanched. Mother, please not now. But Eleanor's hand shot up, silencing her. For too long, this family has pretended loyalty while practicing cruelty. I've watched it. I've held my tongue. But tonight, I will not. She reached into her handbag, the same faded leather satchel she'd carried for decades, and withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age. She placed it on the table with deliberate care. This is your grandfather's will, the real one. My father's face drained of color. My mother's hand froze halfway to her pearls. Ethan leaned forward, suddenly less smug. I felt my pulse roar in my ears as Eleanor slid the envelope toward me. My fingers shook as I broke the seal and pulled out a sheaf of papers. The words blurred at first, but then sharpened. I, Richard Cole. Being of sound mind, leave the Cole Lake House and 20% of company shares to my granddaughter, Marissa Cole. My breath caught. 20%. Not a token. A stake. Proof that someone in this family had seen me, valued me, believed in me. My grandfather had not forgotten me. My parents had. My father's fist slammed the table, rattling glasses. This is outrageous! That document was superseded! No! Eleanor interrupted, her eyes flashing. I was executor. I know what he signed. I know what you concealed. You stole from her. You buried the will, drafted your own, and handed everything to Ethan. You thought no one would challenge you because she was too quiet, too obedient. But you underestimated her, and you underestimated me. The guests gasped, whispers breaking out like wildfire. Ethan sputtered, reaching for the papers. This is ridiculous. She's making this up. She's old. She doesn't remember. But Eleanor's cane slammed against the floor with surprising force. Do not patronize me, boy. I remember every word. I was there when your grandfather said Marissa deserves her share. She has the strength this family will need. And I watched as your parents twisted his legacy into a weapon of favoritism. Tonight, that ends. My hands tightened on the will, the weight of it heavier than any cake or candle could ever be. Proof of love. Proof of betrayal, proof of theft. The world tilted the ground, shifting beneath us. My mother's tears vanished, replaced by venom. Marissa, don't listen. She's confused. You know how old age is. But I cut her off, my voice steady clear. No. For once, I do listen. And I believe her. Because this makes sense of everything, why I was erased, why Ethan was elevated, why nothing I did was ever enough. You didn't just forget me. You robbed me. You robbed me of my birthright, my recognition, my dignity. The guests stared, the spell broken. My parents' carefully crafted image cracked wide open, their secrets spilling across the table with the same finality as the will in my hands. For the first time in decades, I wasn't invisible. I was undeniable. The morning after that dinner, I sat in my apartment with the will spread out before me, my grandmother's words still ringing in my ears. The weight of it pressed down on me not just as proof of what I was owed, but as proof of everything that had been stolen. For years, I had convinced myself I was invisible because I wasn't worthy. Now I knew the truth I had been erased because it served their greed, and greed, unlike love, left a paper trail. I made the call to a law firm downtown, one that specialized in probate and estate litigation. The receptionist's polite voice barely disguised her curiosity when I said the Cole name. Within a week, I sat across from attorney Michael Graves, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that made you feel both uneasy and protected at once. He flipped through the will, the receipts, the photos nodding occasionally, his expression darkening. Finally, he leaned back and said, "Marissa, what your parents did concealing a valid will and distributing assets outside of probate is fraud. You not only have a case, you have a strong one. With these documents and your grandmother's testimony, this could dismantle their entire narrative." The words should have scared me. Instead, they steadied me. For once, justice wasn't a distant fantasy, it was within reach. We filed the petition to reopen my grandfather's estate within days. My parents were served with notice, and the fury came swiftly. My mother called her voice venomous. "How dare you drag this family through the mud? Do you know what you're doing?" My father followed with threats. "You think you can fight me? I'll bury you." Ethan sent a text that simply read, "Ungrateful parasite." But the threats did not stop the process. Discovery unearthed bank transfers, proof of assets funneled to Ethan that should have been shared. My grandmother sat beside me during depositions, her voice unwavering as she recounted the day my grandfather signed the will. When Ethan tried to shout her down the court, reporter told him to quiet himself. For the first time, his arrogance looked like desperation. The trial became front-page news in our county. Heirs battle over Cole fortune. Neighbors whispered, colleagues asked cautious questions, and my parents' carefully polished reputation began to crack. In the courtroom, the evidence laid bare the truth my grandfather's signature notarized, financial records showing deliberate concealment, witnesses confirming that Ethan's banquets had been funded with misappropriated money. My parents sat stone-faced as their lies unraveled. When the judge finally spoke, her words echoed like a verdict on my entire life. "This court finds that the decedent's original will was concealed and that assets were wrongfully diverted. The Cole Lake House and 20% of the family company shares are hereby restored to the rightful heir, Marissa Cole." A gasp swept the courtroom. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, my father slumped in his chair, and Ethan stormed out, his face crimson. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras flashing as though they had captured the fall of royalty. Justice was not just a ruling, it was a reckoning. The lake house was transferred into my name within weeks. A forensic accountant calculated the profits I should have received from the company's shares over the years, and the court ordered restitution. For once, the weight of financial imbalance tipped in my favor, not because of charity, but because it was mine by right. The fallout for my parents was swift. Business partners distanced themselves, clients fled, and whispers of fraud chased them through every social circle they once ruled. Ethan's smug smile disappeared from society pages. Creditors demanded repayment for the life of luxury he had financed with stolen money. As for me, the day I walked into the lake house with the keys in my hand, sunlight spilling across the water, I felt something I hadn't in decades: vindication. Not just for the birthdays forgotten, but for every sacrifice dismissed, every humiliation endured. The law had given me what love never had: recognition, validation, justice. The first night I spent in the lake house, I left the curtains wide open. Moonlight spilled across the polished wooden floors, silver ripples dancing on the surface of the water outside. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to have a space that was truly mine, not borrowed, not paid for in silence, not shadowed by someone else's glory. Now I stood barefoot in the middle of a house my grandfather had wanted me to have, breathing in the quiet, and I felt the weight of belonging. I started slowly. I painted the guest rooms in warm colors, filled the shelves with books I had never had time to read, and let laughter echo across the porch as I invited friends over. My co-workers, the ones who had watched me grind through late nights at the firm, brought wine and homemade casseroles. Neighbors arrived with flowers and pie. Even Mrs. Bennett, now stooped with age, came with a smile and said, "I always knew you deserved more child." Their presence turned the house from a shell into a home. For my 28th birthday, I did something I had never done before. I planned a celebration for myself. Not a banquet dripping in chandeliers, not an ostentatious display designed to impress strangers, but a gathering that felt real. Strings of fairy lights hung across the porch paper lanterns floated on the lake, and a simple homemade cake sat on the table, chocolate with vanilla frosting, the kind I had always loved. When the night came, the house glowed with warmth. Friends filled the yard, their laughter mingling with the sound of water lapping against the dock. Someone strummed a guitar, children darted through the grass, and for once, the candles on the cake were mine to blow out. When everyone sang happy birthday, my name rang clear in the night air, no longer swallowed by silence. I closed my eyes, made a wish, and realized I didn't need it to come true. I was already living it. Later, standing by the water with a glass of wine in my hand, I watched the reflection of lanterns drift across the lake. My grandmother sat in a rocking chair on the porch, her eyes shining as she watched the celebration. "He'd be proud of you," she said softly, meaning my grandfather. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, and nodded. I hope so. What I knew in that moment was this: I no longer needed my parents' validation. I didn't crave Ethan's shadow or long for their empty applause. My worth wasn't something they could grant or withhold. I had built it, fought for it, claimed it with evidence and resolve. And in reclaiming what was mine, I had also reclaimed myself. That night ended not with speeches or champagne fountains, but with quiet joy, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. I walked back inside the lake house, closed the door behind me, and felt finally at home. News traveled fast in our town, faster than the wind that rippled across the lake. By the time autumn leaves had begun to fall, the Cole name no longer carried prestige, it carried scandal. The trial transcripts circulated in the local paper, neighbors whispered over morning coffee, and every headline carried the same story: a family dynasty built on favoritism and fraud, dismantled by the very daughter they tried to erase. My father's business empire collapsed almost overnight. Contracts dissolved as partners refused to be associated with someone accused of concealing a will and defrauding his own child. The firm that once boasted marble lobbies and catered lunches shut its doors within months. Creditors circled, lawsuits piled up, and the man who once thundered that I owed him everything now faced debts he couldn't repay. My mother, stripped of her glittering social calendar, found herself uninvited from luncheons and galas. Diamonds that once drew admiration now drew whispers. For years, she had weaponized appearances. Now appearances betrayed her. Ethan fared no better. The lavish lifestyle he had paraded on yachts and banquets turned to ashes. With no more family money to prop him up, creditors repossessed his car, foreclosed on his condo, and left him scrambling. I heard through acquaintances that he tried to charm investors into funding a startup, but his reputation, smug, spoiled, and stained by scandal, shut every door in his face. The golden boy had tarnished, and no one rushed to polish him clean. I did not celebrate their downfall, not in the way they had celebrated my invisibility. But I will admit there was justice in watching the scales finally balance. Justice in seeing that choices had consequences, that cruelty left a mark deeper than they ever intended. For me, life took on a steadier rhythm. The lake house became more than a symbol. It became a sanctuary. I spent mornings sipping coffee on the porch, evenings sharing meals with friends who had become family, and weekends hosting small gatherings filled with real laughter, not the brittle performance I grew up with. Each candle I lit, each birthday I marked, was no longer about proving my worth to anyone else. It was about honoring the girl who once sat alone with a single cupcake, whispering her name into the dark. Sometimes I drive past the old estate. The once manicured lawns are overgrown, the lights dark, the gates rusting. It looks abandoned, a monument to arrogance and neglect. I don't stop. I don't need to. The ghosts of who I used to be are buried there, but I am not. On my 30th birthday, 3 years after the trial, I stood on the porch of the lake house, surrounded by friends, colleagues, neighbors, and my grandmother. The night air hummed with warmth, the cake glowed with candles, and when everyone sang my name, I didn't just hear it, I felt it in my bones. I raised my glass and said, "Sometimes family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who see you stand with you and celebrate you when others won't." The cheers that followed weren't polite applause. They were real from hearts that meant it. And in that moment, I knew I had not only reclaimed what was mine, but also built something stronger than the fragile facade my parents clung to. I was no longer invisible. I was undeniable. and I would never let them erase me again.